appreciate everybody coming out tonight on a rainy day. You guys are the diehards, and I appreciate seeing that. What we're going to be talking about today is the period after Charleston has fallen. And when Charleston fell, that was almost the darkest time in South Carolina Revolutionary War history. Now, there was an occurrence that happened about 3 months after Charleston fell, when Camden fell, the Battle of Camden, and that was a disaster for Patriot forces. But a primary emphasis tonight is going to be on the battles that occurred after Charleston fell, and what was that resistance that the Patriot forces were having during that time. So one thing I want to show you is a map that describes the area that the British took over practically immediately after the fall of Charleston. When Charleston fell, 95% of South Carolina was now under British domination. And the British set up a series of forts throughout the state. Now, they had Savannah, and another fort was at Augusta. These are two in Georgia. Those were the only two towns in Georgia. Savannah and Augusta and the entire state of Georgia remained under British control until the very end of the war, until the Treaty of Paris was signed. Georgia remained as a British holding. But to complete the circle that was around Charleston, there was a fort at 96, which is the backcountry fort, not too far from here. That was the primary fort that serviced the 96th district, the area where we are. There was another major fort at Camden, and then one spot that's not shown on this map, Georgetown. So here was a ring of forts protecting Charleston. And in between these forts, there were communication posts, which were forts in and of themselves. Fort Mott, for instance, Fort Watson, just a number of them throughout the entire state, about 20-25 miles apart. The distance that a rider would travel in a day, that's about how far apart the forts were. From 96, there was a series of outposts based on what was going on at 96. One of those outposts was Fort Williams, which is on the Little River at the Newberry-Lawrence County line. Fort Williams was the home place of James Williams, who was the most ardent patriot in the Little River District, or Lawrence County as it's called today. And we're going to be talking about James Williams several times throughout the program tonight. Also, other forts based on 96, being serviced from 96, was Fort Prince in the middle of Spartanburg County, right in here. Fort Gowan, which was on the border between the Cherokee Territory and Spartanburg County. Cherokee Territory was Greenville County at that time. So right at the intersection of North Carolina, Greenville County, and Spartanburg County was Fort Gowan. We'll be talking about that as well. Fort Thickety in Cherokee County was one of the forts, and Musgrove Mill was another communication fort, a communication post that will be part of tonight's discussion. Another map that I wanted to show you to orient you to what was happening during this time that the British had taken over Charleston. Now, the 4 westernmost counties in South Carolina, this was Cherokee Territory, okay? you can see the border between South Carolina and North Carolina here. All of this area was under British control. And this happened very quickly after Charleston fell. Patriot leaders in the state surrendered to the British when Charleston fell. The leading general in South Carolina at this time was Andrew Williamson. He had his plantation on Hard Labor Creek in Greenwood County. Andrew Williamson led the Cherokee War of 1776. He was the general. Andrew Williamson was senior to Marion, Sumter, and Pickens. He was their boss until Charleston fell, and he surrendered to the British cause. He even recruited for the British because he wanted peace in the back country. And at this point, he felt like the British could offer that the easiest. And at one time, Andrew Williamson was referred to as the Benedict Arnold of South Carolina. However, he was saved from retribution by none other than Nathaniel Greene, who was such a brilliant general in charge of what happened in South Carolina. Nathaniel Greene stated that Andrew Williamson was actually serving as a double agent and was feeding information to the Patriot cause, which he thought was very helpful, and that saved Andrew Williamson from losing everything he had. He eventually moved down to a plantation around Charleston on the low country, and we hardly ever heard of him again. Another Patriot leader who surrendered to the British cause was Andrew Pickens. And what Andrew Pickens wanted was protection. And he said to the British, "If you can protect me, I will lay down my arms." And he did lay down his arms. And he was neutral until just before Cowpens, when a rogue band of Tory marauders led by James Dunlop, remember that name, a rogue band of Tory marauders under the direction of James Dunlop, when Pickens wasn't there, they plundered his plantation. They left the house standing. They burned down all the rest of his buildings. They abused Andrew Pickens' family. And Andrew Pickens was just incensed over that. So he marched into the British headquarters in the fort at 96, and he knew the commanding officer. His name was Q, K-E-W. He said, "You've broken your promise to me to give me protection. Tomorrow morning, I'm taking up arms against you." And the British officer could have arrested him right there and then, but he didn't. He let Pickens leave the camp at 96, and Pickens, that was right before Cowpens, and Pickens did such a wonderful job at Cowpens, and he got promoted to general based on what he did at Cowpens. So other features that we need to be aware of on this map. Hillsborough, North Carolina. While all of Georgia, 95% of South Carolina was under British control, there was safe haven for the Patriot cause in western North Carolina and western Virginia. This area was safe territory for the Patriot causes. Virginia was the breadbasket of the Patriots at that time. This is where the finest horses were in Virginia. And again, North Carolina was safe as well. The resistance to the British forces was just right along the South Carolina, North Carolina border in this area around Cheraw and the Waxhaws. This was the area where Thomas Sumter was operating. Thomas Sumter had teamed up with William R. Davie from North Carolina. William R. Davie is born in South Carolina, buried in South Carolina. He was from the Waxhaws, and at that time, we really didn't know where the border was between South Carolina and North Carolina, but this area is referred to as the Waxhaws, and William R. Davie, that was his area. William R. Davie is a future governor of North Carolina. William R. Davie founded the University of North Carolina. So that was one of the pockets of resistance. The other pocket of resistance was in western North Carolina, where Charles McDowell had his standing army. So two safe havens, Sumter's command and Charles McDowell in North Carolina. I did want to point out to you Halifax. This is where William Washington, George Washington's second cousin once removed, who was the cavalry commander for Greene. William Washington lost his command at Leonard's Ferry around here. Tarleton whipped him good. Washington got away. He had to swim the swollen Santee River. It was hundreds of yards wide at the time. And William Washington traveled all the way up to Halifax, where he recruited a new cavalry corps. He missed Camden because he was still training his men. He trained them for about 4 months over there before he joined the fray. And we'll be talking about William Washington as well. You see Fort Prince, Cowpens, Kings Mountain, Ramseur's Mill. So again, when Charleston fell, the Loyalists in South Carolina and in North Carolina had a resurgence of activity. They felt like they were on the winning side now. And there was a Loyalist militia leader in North Carolina named John Moore. And he gathered a group of 1,200 Loyalists in near Lincolnton, North Carolina. There was a nice little hill there, and he had his men sitting up on top of the hill. Well, another Patriot general who was resisting the British was Griffith Rutherfordton. Rutherfordton, North Carolina is named after him. From Griffith Rutherford's command, there was a colonel or captain, his name was Locke, L-O-C-K-E, who took a group of 400 Patriots to scout out what John Moore and his 1,200 Loyalists were doing on top of that hill near Lincolnton. And when they got there, the Loyalists did not know they were approaching. They sent out scouts. They could see that there was poor camp security. It was a very foggy morning. You could not see 10 feet in front of you. And Colonel Locke decided to charge those 1,200 Loyalists with his 400 Patriots. Now the Loyalists were very disorganized. A third of them did not even have weapons. But Locke and his Patriots charged up that hill and routed the 1,200 Loyalists that were there at Ramseur's Mill. There were about 100 casualties on both sides, and those men are buried on that hill. But that was a Patriot victory. June the 20th, 1780. Charleston falls on May the 12th, 1780. This is, a little more than a month later. Ramseur's Mill, now we don't talk about this battle too much in South Carolina. This is a North Carolina battle. But Ramseur's Mill was the first action where there was a resistance against the British forces and there was a Patriot victory. Cornwallis was furious with John Moore over what he had done because they weren't ready. He wanted them to gather an army up, and when Cornwallis moved through North Carolina, that was the point he wanted these Loyalist militiamen to join him, but they didn't, and that was a Patriot victory. July the 12th, 1780. This is about a month after Ramseur's Mill. Again, the British were raiding through the back country, and one of the raiders was a Philadelphia lawyer named Christian Huck. That's him right there. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so Christian Huck was a loyalist in Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia was the capital of the Continental Army, and it was, Patriot, and Christian Huck was abused in Philadelphia. Everybody was picking on him and things like that. Well, the British came and they captured Philadelphia. Now, all of a sudden, Christian Huck has got a position of leadership with the Patriot force, with the Loyalist forces. And he comes down with Clinton and Tarleton and all of them into Charleston, and he's sent on a raid. Now, he was one of Tarleton's men. At this point, Tarleton was sick, and I think he may have had smallpox. It was a serious illness that Tarleton missed about a month or so of the fighting. Christian Huck was leading this raid through the back country. One of the places he went to was William Hill's Iron Works, which was one of the leading industrial sites in South Carolina. There were a few iron foundries in the state. Wofford's had one over in Spartanburg, William Hill, and he could make cannonballs there. He could make all kinds of farm implements, everything. Iron foundries were very important during that time, and Christian Huck burned Williams Hill's foundry to the ground. Williams Hill was one of Sumter's men, and he was a very capable colonel throughout the entire Revolutionary War. He kind of shouldn't have made William Hill as mad as he did. Well, let's see. Something's happened here. Barton, can I have you take a look at this? Okay, thank you. Yep. Appreciate it. I will show you that right on the border is where William Hill's ironworks were. And then after the ironworks was burned, Christian Huck continued his journey, and he goes to the William Bratton's residence. And Bratton was another Patriot leader. And when Huck came on to the Bratton property, Martha Bratton, Mrs. Bratton, she sent a manservant, a slave named Watt, to go warn her husband that Christian Huck was on the loose. And Christian Huck held a reaping hook to the neck of Martha Bratton and says, "Where is your husband? Where is William Bratton? If you don't tell me, I'm going to cut your head off." Well, she didn't tell him, and she didn't get her head cut off either. But the next morning, now that Bratton and his men knew that where Huck was, and he had left the Bratton plantation and he went to the Williamson plantation which was just a few miles away. And they spent the night there, and they were having breakfast the next morning. And at that time, William Bratton and Richard Wynn, Edward Lacey, William Hill, some of the premier colonels of Sumter's regiment attacked Christian Huck. This was July the 12th, 1780. And Huck and his men were killed. And that was one of the first victories over the provincial troops of the British, because Huck's men were Americans, American loyalists who had been trained in how to fight in the British way. This is William Bratton's plantation house. Actually, I think this is an antebellum home. This is from Brattonsville. If you ever have a chance to go to Brattonsville, I highly encourage that. It is a antebellum community. They do lots of exhibits on the pioneer days and how things were done back, 200 years ago. And that's an interesting place, and it's worthwhile. Also, on July the 12th, 1780, a series of battles occurred in Spartanburg County. And these series of battles I'm getting ready to describe to you is what we're going to be seeing at a field trip on Saturday. 4 days in Spartanburg County that pushed the British lines back 40 miles. So I hope that y'all can join me on Saturday. Y'all are the diehards. I kind of expect to see you there. But anyway, what happened in Spartanburg County begins with the fight of Kelsey Creek, which was in June of 1780. What had happened was, when Charleston was threatened, the governor of the state of South Carolina, John Rutledge, he ordered a ton of gunpowder to be delivered to the safest place that he could think of in South Carolina. And that was the fortified home of John Thomas Sr. John Thomas Sr. was the commander of the Spartan Regiment. He founded the Spartan Regiment. Spartanburg is named after the Spartan Regiment. John Thomas Sr. also gave his parole because he was primarily concerned with the Cherokee incursions into the backcountry of South Carolina. John Thomas Sr. was an Indian fighter. He killed a lot of Indians. He killed a lot of Cherokees. But that was his mission. That was Andrew Pickens' mission. That was Andrew Williamson's mission. They were more concerned about the Cherokees than they were the British. And they thought that the British could help protect them from Cherokee incursions. But the British couldn't protect him, so they quickly gave up on that idea. But John Thomas Sr., having given his parole, saying he would not fight against the British interest, he still had a ton of gunpowder stashed at his home and fort. And a contingent from 96 knew that that gunpowder was there. And they sent, it was a relatively small patrol, 15, 20 men, something like that. They sent that to John Thomas Sr.'s house to capture the gunpowder and capture him as well because he had broken his parole. Well, John Thomas Sr. knew that they were coming, so he and his son and several others of the Spartan Regiment, they gathered up the gunpowder and they skedaddled, and they left John Thomas Sr.'s son-in-law there, Josiah Culbertson, who was a captain in the Spartan Regiment. Josiah Culbertson was there with Jane Black Thomas, John Thomas Sr.'s wife, who was a heroine in her own right, and the women of the house and the young children of the house. And John Thomas Sr.'s fort was surrounded with only Josiah Culbertson up in the eave of the log cabin. And Josiah Culbertson started shooting at the attacking loyalist. Well, he was shooting with his rifle. And with those frontier rifles, you have one shot, and then you take 60 seconds loading that up for the second shot. But what was happening in that house was there were 8 or 9 rifles that were there, and the women and children were loading those rifles as Josiah Culbertson was shooting the rifles. So he'd shoot once, they'd pass him, and he'd shoot again, and they'd pass him, and they'd shoot again. So the attacking force thought that there was 10 people defending that home, and they left. Jane Black Thomas, during this time, she was running bullets in the fireplace. She was melting lead into the moles and giving them so that they could load the rifles and fight off the attacking loyalist. During that time, John Thomas Sr. was captured, and he got sent down to 96, to the jail at 96. And Jane Black Thomas went down there as well. This is what they did back there. She was like a camp follower or a hanger's-on, if you will. While her husband was in jail in that 3-story brick building, she was there. She would be getting food for him and any other prisoner that was there. She would be washing clothes. She would be tending to various needs that the prisoners had. And this is how they operated back there. This was okay. So Jane Black Thomas is at the little creek that is the only water supply at 96, and she was washing clothes, and she heard some other Tory women talking about a raid that was going to leave the next morning to go to Cedar Springs because there was a band of Patriots there. Cedar Springs is right here. This is where John Thomas Sr. had his house. This is where Cedar Springs was. When John Thomas Sr. got captured, the command of the Spartan regiment was turned over to his son, John Thomas Jr. John Thomas Sr., Jane Black Thomas, John Thomas Jr., these are heroes. These are Patriot heroes. They were in Spartanburg County. In addition, their daughters married Josiah Culbertson, captain in the Spartan militia, and Joseph McJunkin, who was a major in the Spartan regiment. So this is a very distinguished, this is almost like Spartanburg County militia royalty, if you will. So John Thomas Sr. is now the leader of the Spartan regiment, and he's camped at Cedar Springs. Jane Black Thomas is in 96, 60 miles away. She gets word that there's going to be a Tory raid on Cedar Springs, and all of a sudden she realizes that raid is going for her son and his compatriots. And that night, she gets on a horse and she rides 60 miles to Cedar Springs. And she tells her son about the ambush, about the attack. So the son sets up an ambush. That night, they build up the fires at Cedar Springs. Like they got a big, huge campfire. And they've got bonfires throughout the area. So when the attacking loyalists come, they come into the camp. They expect to find John Thomas Jr. and his men sleeping. They walk in front of those fires, and all of a sudden they're illuminated. And John Thomas Jr. And the Patriots are set up in the woods line. They let loose a volley. Boom. It was devastating. It wiped out about 20-25% of the loyalists that were there. And so that was a victory there at Cedar Springs. That's July the 12th, 1780. Well, after that attack occurred, when the loyalists regrouped, they skedaddle all the way across Spartanburg County to Fort Gowan, which is up here. And they settle in at that fort, and we're going to see Fort Gowan. In the meantime, a group of Georgia refugees. See, as bad as it was in South Carolina, it was very bad in Georgia as well. The back country of Georgia now was under attack from all the Georgian loyalists that were there. There were 200 homes burned in the back country of Georgia. It was devastating. So a group of Georgia refugees under John Jones is coming up from Georgia. Now, where they're going is McDowell's camp in North Carolina. They're headed this way. And they're coming up from Georgia, and they happen to stop in at Fort Gowan. And that is where the men who had just been defeated the day before from Cedar Springs, about 30 or so of them, they are at Fort Gowan. And here comes John James and his Georgia refugees. There's about 25 of them. They come into the fort, and all of a sudden, Jones and the refugees realize they're in the middle of a bunch of Tories. And so what do? They're like, hey, we're Tories too. This is wonderful. I'm glad we're band together. We'll work together on this deal. So they have a nice fine supper that evening, and they go to bed that night. And in the middle of the night, the Patriot forces, the Georgia refugees, they rise up and they take the loyalists under control. And there was a fight. One of the loyalists was killed. The rest of the men were captured, and they were paroled. They were made to sign a statement saying that they were going to not fight against the British for the rest of the war under the threat of pain of death. The Georgia refugees took the weapons, they took the horses, the weapons that they couldn't carry away, they destroyed, and they moved on to Charles McDowell's camp right here on Earl's Ford on the North Fork of the Packlet River, which is on the North Carolina, South Carolina state line. Highway 14 is where Earl's Ford is. We're going to see Earl's Ford. So there was a major British outpost at Fort Prince, somewhere down in here. Let's see. It's about in the middle of the county. James Dunlop, remember him? He burned down Pickens Plantation. James Dunlop is at Fort Prince. And the loyalists who were the survivors of Fort Gowan, who had now been paroled, they all come to Fort Prince and they tell James Dunlop about what happened at Fort Gowan. And James Dunlop, he's pretty upset over that. So he takes a force of about, I'm going to say 150 men from Fort Prince to attack the Georgia refugees. He's thinking that he's going to be attacking these 25 Georgia men. Does not realize that the Georgia refugees at this time have already hooked up with Charles McDowell's camp in North Carolina. Charles McDowell's got 300 or 400 men at this time. Before they settled down for the evening, Charles McDowell sent out a patrol to scout for loyalists in the area. You know, that was his security for his camp. Patrolling that area to see if there are any bad guys out there. Well, that patrol got lost and never made it back to McDowell's camp, never reported to McDowell. And what McDowell assumes is that, oh, well, no news is good news. And he had his command settle in for the evening. No pickets, one picket, only one picket. Poor camp security. So here is Dunlop coming up from Fort Prince, and he knows where the camp is. He does not realize that it's McDowell's camp and the Georgia refugees. He's thinking he's just going to be attacking 25 Georgia refugees. And they walk into the camp while the camp is asleep. And they start stabbing, bayoneting militiamen as they're sleeping. And there were 2 militiamen killed during that time. They were both teenagers. One of them was the son of Ned Hampton, who was in McDowell's camp. Well, you know, after they killed 2 men and wounded 6 others. And at this time, the camp was aroused. They knew something was going on. So Charles McDowell, you know, gathers his men. He knows where the attack has occurred. Dunlop and his men at this time had set up a defensive perimeter behind a fence. And Charles McDowell decides to charge in the middle of the night towards that defensive position. And the Loyalists under Dunlop let loose a volley, and 6 men are killed at that time. And that was the end of what happened there at Earl's Ford. Now, Charles McDowell was a very valuable, great Patriot leader, but he lost his position over that, what he did. I mean, people turned on him as a result of, you know, poor management, poor leadership. Now, his brother Joseph took over, and Joseph was very competent, and Joseph was a hero at Cowpens. So they didn't really lose any ability, but Charles McDowell, you know, he was really criticized over those actions. So Dunlop and his men start retreating back to Fort Prince. Ned Hampton, whose son had just been bayoneted to death in his sleep, he gathers up about 100 men and they get the finest horses, and they start chasing after Dunlop, and he chased him all the way back to Fort Prince. There was a running gun battle all the way through here. At Shiloh Church is where Hampton really caught up with Dunlop, and there was a battle there, and 8 of Dunlop's men were killed at that point. But there was a running gun battle through Spartanburg County until Dunlop reached the safety of Fort Prince. We're going to see Fort Prince. And when they got there, Alexander Ennis was the British commander in charge. Hampton saw that Fort Prince, and by the way, let's see. Oops. This is the hill where Gowan's Fort was, we think. We're going to see that. This is where the Battle of Earl's Ford occurred. Many of you know Wayne Rogers. Wayne Rogers is responsible for this roadside display. He was the archaeologist that found where the actual battle was. This is Fort Prince. This is an artist rendering of Fort Prince. Fort Prince had 15-foot tall palisades. Here you can barely see there's a frieze around there. There's a defensive ditch. Fort Prince was really impregnable to attack. So Hampton called off the chase at that time. But as a result of everything that happened, Cedar Springs, Fort Gowan, Earl's Ford, Ennis realized Spartanburg County is too hot to handle. And he retreats back to Musgrove Mill. He retreats 40 miles. And those 4 actions in 4 days, July the 12th to July the 16th, 1780, is what pushed the British lines back. And that's what happened in Spartanburg County. This is Fort Prince today. It's in that copse of trees. right here is a little monument that I'm going to show you. This is the monument at Fort Prince. Fort Prince is threatened. This site is threatened. You can't see it, but just to the right is a 100,000 square foot warehouse. This is prime warehouse property. There's a family that's owned this site for well over 100 years. The matriarch of that family, she's 85 years old. Nothing's going to happen while she's living, but she's 85 years old. The DAR owns a 10-foot square plot of land here. So there won't be a a factory right on top of this, but again, this is a threatened site. This was in July of 1780. Can anybody guess the name of this battlefield? Hanging Rock. Very, very good. When I first heard of Hanging Rock, I was thinking, oh, that's where they must have hung a bunch of Tories or something like that. But no, it's named after this rock. Here's a really nice little monument that was put up in 1910. You can read that. Here was fought the Battle of the Hanging Rock, August the 6th, 1781. I'm here to tell you folks, that ain't where Hanging Rock Battle was fought. I got fooled. I wrote a nice little story about Hanging Rock, but I knew Hanging Rock was a cavalry battle, and I couldn't figure out how in all these rocks that were hanging around there near Lancaster and Chester County, how cavalry could maneuver through that territory. With that little bit, that didn't keep me from writing up a story about Hanging Rock, because I didn't know better. This is really what the Hanging Rock battlefield looks like. The Hanging Rock was a cavalry battle, and it was over about 160 acres. It's just wide open field. This is just a spot that's kind of close by Hanging Rock. On August the 1st, Sumter wanted to attack the British outpost. And the outpost that he chose to attack was Rocky Mount. And Rocky Mount was constructed in the same fashion that Fort Prince was. And Rocky Mount was defended by 300 British provincials. And Sumter had about 600 or 700 men, so we felt pretty good about it. Now, there was also a British contingent at Hanging Rock, which is about 10, 12, 15 miles away. Sumter was worried that if he attacked Rocky Mount, that the forces at Hanging Rock would come to the rescue. So he had William R. Davie attack Hanging Rock as a diversion and also to keep reinforcements from coming to Rocky Mount. But Rocky Mount was impregnable, and Sumter could not make any headway there, so he retreated. William R. Davie joined up with him on the retreat, and William R. Davie says, really, over there at Hanging Rock, those are pretty sorry defenses. We need to do something about that. So about 5 or 6 days later, Sumter decides that no, he's not going to attack Rocky Mount, he's going to attack Hanging Rock. And at this location, there was a battlefield, a battle where Sumter was very effective. I mean, he won that battle. So this is another nail in the coffin of British fortunes in South Carolina. I told you about McDowell's camp. I'm going to go back, show you this picture here. So, McDowell is in western North Carolina. It's under Joseph McDowell at this time. James Williams from Lawrence County, he was the most ardent patriot in the county. He has a force of about 50 or 60 men, maybe even 100. He takes this Lawrence County group up to join with McDowell's camp. Elijah Clark was the hardest fighting Georgian in the backcountry. He arrives in McDowell's camp with about 60 or 100 Georgians. Isaac Shelby, over the mountain in Tennessee, he knows that South Carolina has fallen. The next on Cornwallis's list is North Carolina, and anything that happens in North Carolina is going to affect Isaac Shelby back here over the mountain in Tennessee, present-day Tennessee. So he comes over with about 50 or 60 men, and they all join up with McDowell's camp. In the meantime, they get word that John Moore was the Loyalist leader at Lincolnton, at Ramsewer's Mill. His brother, Patrick Moore, was operating in South and North Carolina, in through this area here. Loyalist plunderers. So Williams, Clark, and Shelby get word that there's a group of about 100 Tory plunderers in the backcountry of South Carolina and North Carolina. And they're at McDowell's camp back here. And they can't stand Patrick Moore causing depredations on Patriot homesteads in that area. So they decide to attack him. And where they attack him is here. This is Fort Thickety. Now, this is a facsimile of Fort Thickety. This is the site where Fort Thickety was. Fort Thickety was built during the French and Indian War as protection from the Cherokees. But during the Revolutionary War, it was refortified, and it had palisades all around it. It had a structure like this, which would have been the family homestead, but was also set up for defensive fight. That's the way that these frontier forts were set up. They were log cabin structures like this, but they had ditches and parapets and palisades for defense. This particular building, Fort Thickety site, has probably been habitated for the last 250 years, for the whole time ever since the Revolutionary War. And there was a family that lived there for over 100 years and raised 3 generations on this site. Now they had a nice home built back in here, actually on top of the hill. I saw a picture of this structure taken from the 1940s. All that was there was these bottom 3 rungs of logs with a tin roof on top of those logs. I mean, this was only about 8 feet tall, but it was used as a barn. They kept cattle in there, and they hay and stuff like that. And for 150 years, the family was like, that's Fort Thickety, that's Fort Thickety. But it's not, it can't be Fort. They wouldn't have built it there. But you can see where the palisades at Fort Thickety were. It's on this site, but it wasn't here in particular. And the Cherokee History and Historic Preservation Society, CHAPS, restored this building. They got these other additional logs from other log cabins in the vicinity, and they built this, and now this is an interpretive site where you can explain what happened at Fort Thickety. So Patrick Moore is in Fort Thickety with 93 men. And Williams, Clark, and Shelby have word that he's in this fort. So Isaac Shelby takes his men and he surrounds the fort, and he says to Patrick Moore, says, you know, you better surrender, or we're going to attack your fort and destroy everything you've got. And Patrick Moore says, I will defend this fort to the last extremity. So, you know, that was kind of a little bit of a standoff. Then the next morning, from this woods line right here, Isaac Shelby emerges, and he's got 600 men with him. And Patrick Moore looks at those men and he says, well, I think I'll reconsider my position here. And he surrendered. He surrendered without firing a shot. And this was Isaac Shelby's first victory in South Carolina. You know, yeah, it was good that he captured 93 Tories and he made them sign their parole and they were let loose that way. But probably the best haul of all from this surrender was that there were 250 muskets that were captured at that time, and those muskets were loaded with buck and ball. And when you shoot a 75 caliber musket ball with 3 or 4 20 caliber shotgun pellets out of one of those muskets, that is a very deadly combination of munitions. And if Isaac Shelby had have attacked that fort full-fledged, he would have had a lot of casualties. Patrick Moore was censured by the British for what he did there. But this is Isaac Shelby's first foray into South Carolina. He came in 3 different times. The first time that he was here is what we're basically talking about tonight. Then there was a little skirmish at the peach orchard in Spartanburg County. Shelby's men were out collecting peaches. There were loyalists out collecting peaches, and they started shooting back and forth at each other. That was kind of a draw. That was about 2 weeks after Fort Thickety. Then in August 16th, 1780, Williams, Shelby, and Clark got word that there were 200 Loyalist forces at Musgrove Mill. And again, they're at McDowell's camp just across the North Carolina border. And when Shelby, Clark, and Williams got that word, they decide that they're going to go attack those Tories at Musgrove Mill. And so they saddle up at dusk and they ride 40 miles all night long through to Musgrove Mill. And when they get there, they are told by a neighbor that overnight the Tories had been reinforced by Alexander Ennis and an additional 300 men. So now all of a sudden there are 500 Tories at Musgrove Mill. Williams, Clark, and Shelby have 200 men. They've ridden all night long. Shots are fired, so there's no element of surprise. What are they going to do? Their horses are worn out. Their horses will not make it back. They cannot retreat. So what they did was they bordered an old Indian agricultural field. This is where the Indians had grown their crops, corn and so forth. And it had grown up in secondary growth, but it wasn't too thick at this time. So Williams, Clark, and Shelby set up a defensive line along the woods line. They make a brush breastworks out of fallen logs and branches and things like that. And the British forces are down here, down below. They don't know that those breastworks are there. And what the Patriots do is Captain Shadrach Inman from Georgia, who is, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Captain Shadrach Inman. What he does is he takes about 5 or 10 of his guys and he starts charging down through this open field. down towards the British who were down below across a little creek. And he's hooping and hollering and yelling at them. And they let loose a couple of musket fire, and Shadrach Inman turns around, he goes back up this way. Well, that didn't produce any results, so Shadrach Inman came back again, hooping and hollering and yelling and screaming as he comes down. The British open fire on him. He's like, nah, can't get me. Turns around and goes back. He does that a third time. Well, that's all that those Tories could stand when he came down a third time. So they charged towards Shadrach Inman. And when they got 110 yards away, all of a sudden they noticed that this woods line is full of 200 Patriot militiamen right there. And the Tories stop and they shoot, and they try to wound as many of those Patriots as they can. Well, they're assigned with Brown Bess and Charleville muskets, which are very effective at 80 yards. They're not so effective as 110 yards. And so they continue to charge, and they're probably loading as they're charging, but they move on up until they get 50 yards away from the Patriot line right here. And at 50 yards away, the Patriots let loose with their rifles. And it was devastating, and it mowed down an entire series of Loyalist militiamen. Alexander Ennis sees what's happening. He sees that his line is threatened, so he charges to the front and he tries to rally his men. Well, as he's doing that, he got shot in the neck and he was unhorsed. And when he went down, all British cohesion evaporated, and the Tories started, leaving, and they crossed the Inaree River to get away from what was happening with the Patriots. And that was a big Patriot victory. And what was so important about that victory is I made a brief mention of the Battle of Camden, which also happened in August of 1780. And the Battle of Camden was a terrible Patriot defeat. Horatio Gates and his army coming down from the north attacked Cornwallis and his army at Camden, and the Patriots were decimated then. Horatio Gates rode his horse to death escaping from that field, and he escaped from history. He was relieved of his command as a result of what happened there. And 3 days after Camden, which was such a disaster, Thomas Sumter was attacked at Fishing Creek, and that was a disaster. This was the lowest point in Patriot fortunes in South Carolina. It was after Camden, after Fishing Creek. But on the same day that Fishing Creek occurred, the Patriots won this victory down at Musgrove Mill, right at the Inaree River, Union, Spartanburg, and Lawrence County, where those county lines meet. That was a very heartening victory for the Patriots and gave them a glimmer of hope. We had these other small battles, Fort Gowan, Earl's Ford, Fort Prince, Hanging Rock, Ramseur's Mill. But once the Patriots lost all of that, or once they lost at Camden and Fishing Creek, the benefit of those battles really kind of got eradicated. But the victory at Musgrove Mill, again, brightened the hopes of the Patriots. James Williams was promoted to general because of his actions at Musgrove Mill. And this is the ranger station at Musgrove Mill, for those of you who hadn't been there. Well, that was what I wanted to talk about as far as the Patriots fighting back. Our next discussion will be Kings Mountain. But I hope that you would join me on Saturday as we look at these 4 sites in Spartanburg County. It's quite an interesting set of events there. And I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. Yes?
So, it seems like time and time again on both sides, Loyalists and Patriots, you have the attack where they didn't set up any security. Was that
This is...
operating procedure? Did they not learn from...
Green changed that. It took, and this is all of this is before Nathaniel Green comes on the scene. So it was ridiculous, the battles that were lost due to poor camp security. And it started, I mean, Tarleton took tremendous advantage of that. He won at Monk's Corner and at Lennon's Ferry and at the Battle of the Waxhaws. Bad camp management. Sumter lost at Fishing Creek. Bad camp management. That's why he lost so bad. I don't understand that. I do know, though, that when Green came on the scene, there was no more bad camp management.
What is the place and time that we're going to remake Saturday?
I'm sorry?
What is the name of the place and time?
Okay. Debbie's not here, is she? She was going to have some cards made of the location of that. Okay. Claude's going to get them. So we've got those cards, printed out of where they are. Yes? Well, he did. I mean, he was at Blackstock's. Thomas Sumter was he didn't cooperate. He was cantankerous as could be. The history does not treat Thomas Sumter well, but his men were absolutely loyal to him. And, let's see. If I can get back to my map. So, after Kings Mountain, Cornwallis was in Charlotte at Kings Mountain. When Ferguson lost, Cornwallis had to retreat, and he retreated back to Winnsboro, right here. That's where he stayed for the winter. Why in the world would Cornwallis go to Winnsboro? I mean, there was no strategic value at all to Winnsboro, except that Winnsboro had never been plundered, and there was forage there in that area. So Cornwallis retreats down to Winnsboro. He's got Tarleton chasing after Sumter down this way. And this is the time when Tarleton says you couldn't catch Marion because he's like a damned old swamp fox. And that's where Marion got his nickname. But what Sumter was doing, and he was west of where Winnsboro was, Cornwallis was going and he was raiding the mills. In the mills, that's where the flour was. That's where you could feed your troops. But Sumter was also raiding those mills. And he was raiding the mills to such extent he would get to them before Cornwallis would get to him. So Cornwallis said, hey, Bannister, forget Marion over there. We got to worry about Sumter. So Sumter comes west at that time, and he starts to chase after Sumter. And Tarleton catches up with Sumter at Blackstock's. And Blackstock's was a super fortified farm with big, heavy logs for fences. And the way it was set up, you could not attack Blackstock's, but Tarleton tried it anyway, and he got totally defeated at Blackstock's. That was Tarleton's first defeat. It was almost his worst defeat. But that was about 6 weeks before Cowpens. But Sumter was here at Blackstocks, which is in Union County, right across from the Spartanburg County line. And Sumter got wounded in that battle. At the very end of the battle, he went to the edge of the battlefield because he wanted to see the disposition of Tarleton's troops and see if he could attack further or attack in the morning or something like that. He got too close to the enemy, and he got shot with a blast of buckshot that got him in his right shoulder. He had buckshot lodged in his back and in his chest, and he couldn't use his right arm for months afterwards. And that's why Sumter missed Cowpens, because he was wounded at Blackstocks. Sumter. Well, there was interplay with those three, and at this time, you know, Sumter is the senior general. And there was a case in the coastal region, a place called Shubrick's Farm, where Sumter and Marion had grouped together against a British officer, I think his name was Cardell, who had entrenched himself at Shubrick's Farm, somewhat in the same fashion that Blackstocks was set up. And what Sumter did was he had his men set up in an array around the woods line, and he turns to Francis Marion and he says, charge across that open field there and attack those British in the farm buildings. And Marion did, and he got whipped pretty bad. And Francis Marion never spoke to Thomas Sumter again after that. So, you know, that was one of the incidents where Sumter, you know, garnered the animosity of his fellow compatriots. And then Pickens fought with Marion at Eutaw Springs after 96. And the British were retreating from 96, going down to Charleston. Greene chased after them. Pickens and Marion joined together. They led the militia infantry during that time. Marion was senior to Pickens. Marion led the militia at Eutaw Springs. They fought wonderfully together. Now, Pickens got along with everybody. Pickens had special ability. He was a superb leader, but he also knew how to take orders. And it was a little over past the middle of the battle, and Pickens is directing his men. He's leading his men. And in the thick of things, a musket ball comes and it hits Andrew Pickens right here. Now, Andrew Pickens was a very religious man. His nickname was the Fighting Elder. And if there ever was a man who was saved by the grace of God, it's Andrew Pickens, because that musket ball hit the buckle on his sword belt. Knocked him off his horse, knocked him dead. His men gathered around. They started crying because they had lost their leader. But he recuperated, and he was able to, you know, rejoin the fight later on. But Pickens and Marion fought together at Eutaw Springs and fought superbly together. But Sumter was a stinker. He was a stinker. He was supposed to be in on that fight. He was supposed to delay Rawdon's approach to 96. Rawdon relieved the garrison at 96. Pickens was supposed to slow him down and prevent him from coming. Sumter was supposed to slow him down and prevent him from coming, but he didn't. You know, he had his own way of doing things, and it wasn't being cooperative. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate y'all's attention. Thank you very much.